Hey guys, welcome to Module 2. In this module, we're going to cover a few different things. We're going to cover the general kind of design principles that govern how websites are best put together. We're going to talk about the building blocks of a website overall. So obviously websites are built of pages, and how are those pages constructed and all of that. And then we're going to have a very brief introduction to HTML, where we're going to focus on tags and elements and attributes. So a couple things to note. By the end of this module, I need you to turn in a site topic. So this is going to be what your final project is about. I would really suggest for your sake that you keep this topic PG. Some examples of things that people have done in the past: they've done personal sites for themselves where they showcase their previous work. They might build a site for a business that a friend runs or maybe a family member runs. I've had people create sites that document the books that they're currently reading and gives them a forum to review those. So the topic is it's open to whatever you would like it to be about. However, I would really suggest that you spend some time thinking about what you want to spend the rest of the semester working on, because if you pick something that's kind of lame right now, by the end of the semester you're going to have to put a lot of time into this, and if it's not a great idea for you right now, it's not something that you're really energized about, by the end of the semester you're not going to end up doing your best work. The requirements for this are relatively easy. I want you to just write 2 paragraphs, or really no more than 2 paragraphs. It can be 1 paragraph you want, just describing the site, what it is going to be about, and kind of vaguely highlight some of the things that you might put into it. You don't know what all is possible yet, and so I'm not asking that this is like a contract, so whatever you say in this you have to do. It's not like that, but I do expect that you're going to put some thought into what you want it to have. So that is due by the end of this module. You will turn it in on Blackboard. Okay, so let's get started on our first recorded lecture for this module, principles of design. So when we talk about design, there's really 7 principles that we talk about. And whenever I say quality design, I'm typically talking about these 7 things. So proportion, balance, harmony, contrast, focus, rhythm, and unity. So let's go one by one and kind of talk through what I mean by that. So proportion is, how large is an object in comparison to the other things around it. It can deal with size, it can deal with the space between things, all of that. We kind of talk about proportion in terms of a ratio. An effective proportion, it should keep things interesting. It should move the user through the site. So they should start in the top left and move through the site in a way that's logical, and the way that you design your site should help them do that. And so every graphic has some form of a ratio, right? It's some form of a proportion between the height and the width. And so this one is 1 to 1, this one is 2 to 1, and this one is what's called 1 to 1.62. Okay, and I'm going to explain more of that later. So in general, some things to remember: rectangles are a little bit more interesting than squares. So if you have a rectangle as your banner, people are going to be drawn there. Then if you want to put squares maybe underneath that, tiled underneath that, as a way of focusing on different elements, that's pretty good. So I mentioned the 1.1 or 1 to 1.62 a second ago, and that is actually derived from something called the golden ratio, and we see the golden ratio all over. It's something that we have derived out of human aesthetics, and so you'll see it in people's faces that we find attractive. There's a particular ratio between their eyes and how far away they are from one another. We see it in buildings, such that the building is constructed in a way that it meets this golden ratio. And so it's something that you should know about. I'm not going to ask that you ever try to create a box on your site that is 1 to 1.62. That would just be silly, but I just want you to know that that is something that does exist, and that there are some numbers out there that can help you kind of figure that out. So there are a number of different ways to think about proportions. So this one is called an Asian rectangle, and basically it is it's a large square that has a bunch of tiled rectangles within it, and so they are proportional. Um, so that's one way to think about it. But what about irregular shapes? So irregular shapes occur all the time. I mean, look out your window right now and you'll see clouds, right? And they're kind of all over the place. And so some buildings are weird shapes, and some, desktop objects are weird shapes. And so, well, I think that a rectangular format, so an overall rectangle, kind of dictates what is going to be able to agree with one another. So you're probably not going to be able to tile the cloud structure here in a way that it ends up looking proportional. But you might be able to do this. Probably not the circles, right? So you need to be able to create a rectangle out of tiling the shapes. And so symmetry then, it communicates some stability, and it communicates a relatively formal structure. So if you're creating, let's say, a website for a law firm or something, this might be a good way to go. But asymmetry can communicate action. So let's say you're creating a photo site for a snowboarding company. Well, you might want to use an asymmetrical design. So here we have a relatively normal web page. It's got a banner kind of at the top with a navigation. It's got its main content, and then it's got this aside over here. And if we put kind of a graphic over it, we can see that there's 630 pixels of width for the main content, and there's 330 pixels of width for the aside. Okay, and together those things add up to 960. And in the next video in this module, we're going to talk a lot about where that 960 number comes from. But for now, it's enough to know that these are not equal portions, that this has a certain size and that this has a certain size. And in the next video, we're really going to talk about how you can determine those sizes. Okay, so let's talk about balance. Balance denotes an equilibrium, so it's equal in the weight, the importance between something. The force and the weight can counteract another element. So if you have something that you really want to emphasize, you need to make sure that there's balance between that emphasis and the other things on the page, because if you overemphasize the side bar, let's say, people are going to focus there instead of on your main content. So you can really mess yourself up if you do this poorly. Basically, a formal, really symmetrical balance is where it's equally distributed from the center of the page. A geometric inequality, so something that might be like that the 3-column site that we showed a second ago, that really can help you show this asymmetrical balance. And so really what we want to do is we want to use a fulcrum. So things that are really heavy need to go further out or further in, depending on what is on this side. So in this case, you have Homer Simpson on this side. He's way down into the ground, while the rest of the Simpsons family, including Maggie, jumping up and down there, and Santa's little helper pulling him down, they can't keep them balanced. And so if something is of equal weight, they can be of similar distance from the fulcrum, right? It's not going to tilt down. However, let's say that this box is much smaller than this box. To make it equal, you need to put this way closer to the center. So this is kind of an example that gets used widely. A handicap accessible sign can be presented in a formal or an informal way. If you want to present it in a very formal way, make the handicap signal be very large and make it kind of emanate from the center of the image, right? So this is very large, it has a lot of weight. But if you want to make it feel a little bit informal, maybe it's a different kind of space, but you still need to denote it, you can make the text be bold and then put this over here. And so those have, if you were to put a fulcrum here, they pretty much have equal weight on your visual system. So let's show this another way. So here's a geometric center, right? So middle, let me put it right at the middle. Whereas there's an optical center. So the optical center is kind of where you look first. We tend to not look directly at the crossing of the lines, but we tend to look up and to the left. So does it matter online for you to do this? I think so. And I think so because where people are going to look first should be the thing that you want them to read. If you put the thing that you really want them to read way down here, they're never going to read that first. They're going to read all of this other extraneous information and probably actually click away from your site before they get to where you want them to go. So every point on a web page has a 0 point. That's the 0 point is the point where people are going to start reading. And so in this case, people are going to start all the way in the top left, and they're going to come down here to the left, here to the left, here to the left. And it's the same thing as if we space them out. And if you want to see this more in depth, you can go into the PowerPoint on Blackboard, and you can click on this link right here, and it will take you to some heat maps. What heat maps are is they're based on eye tracking research, where they've shown where people look most. And so where things are more red, that means that they looked there longer. So I would suggest you go check those out. They're really interesting. Another kind of balance is called a Mondrian style grid. So it has a lot of different sized shapes, but the big focus is a big fat rectangle. And if this doesn't look super familiar, well, let's go and look at an Apple web page from just a couple years ago when the iPhone 4 came out, and it was essentially that same grid, right? So if we outline the web page, you can see that it has a big square / rectangle as the main focus, and then it's built up of other smaller geometric shapes. Okay, so let's talk about harmony. Harmony is the agreement and proportionate agreement and arrangement between the color and the size and the shapes. So this can deal with any number of different things. And really the ultimate part of this is that the parts of a web page create an orderly whole. So they all need to work together in harmony, or else you're going to have things that are really weird and contrasting. There's 3 types of harmony in design. There's shapes, there's type usage, and there's tones. So shapes is what we've been talking about. So these geometric shapes. Type usage is fonts, and tones is really color. So here's some harmony of shapes, right? So obviously this is not harmonious with this, but you could have this rectangle and this square together and you could make it work. Harmony of type. You might want to use a typeface that matches across a lot of different kinds of web pages, where maybe it's all the same type just over and over, or you might want to have a certain kind of font, which we're going to talk a lot about fonts coming up, but you might want to have what's called a serif font, where it has these little designs on it. You might want to have a serif font with a sans serif font, so this down here does not have any fonts. The harmony of tones is kind of this idea of a color scheme. So color schemes help lead your user through the site. They help direct people to important things. They help them find links. They help them figure out exactly where you want them to be and when, what's important, what's not important. In the same way, you could have contrast, where you could have a really striking difference that still has this sense of harmony. Really, unequals are more interesting than equals is kind of the statement that I'm going to make. And so colors that are close to the exact same, so like 8 different shades of red, is not all that interesting. But if you have red and gray and black put together, that provides you some contrast. That can be interesting. You can also have contrast and type, so you could have something like regular, you could have something like bold. So you could have contrast and size. So remember from the last module when we created that hello world HTML file, this might be an example of an H1 tag, so a large header tag, and this might be an example of a paragraph tag. You could have contrast in vector, which basically means in where it is in XY space. So you could have it be, your primary thing is here and then you come down, whereas your secondary thing is towards the bottom and you expect people to work their way up. In the same, they could start on the left and go to the right, or they could start on the right and go to the left. So what does this mean for actual web design? Well, in this case, we see quite a bit of contrast in color. So we see red against white, red against gray. And then we see some harmonious grays where they're not all that different from each other as it kind of gradients. We also see that all the text that is clickable is going to be in blue, so it cues your reader. And we see that there's a lot of different rectangular shapes where this is clearly the important, this is the primary vector, and then this is all the secondary vector. Same thing for NFL.com. This is an older version of NFL.com, but you can see the same idea. They have a lot of contrast, but not as much as this, right? There's no reds. Reds really pop out. There's no reds on the site. But there's a lot of information here that's your primary, whereas this is your secondary information. Here's another example of this where you can actually just break it up using white and using block text. So same idea, just used in a different way. Okay, so focus. The center of visual impact is really important with where people are going to look. And I didn't make this term up. It's from a guy named Mario Garcia. And if you want to read more about him, you can click on the link in the PowerPoint. The CVI, the center of visual impact, is that one element on the page. So it's one thing, and it is 3 to 5 times bigger than all the other elements. So if we go back a couple, you'll see this is quite clearly the CVI, right? It's much larger than anything else. And so all other elements are intended to support the CVI. So in this case, your banner or whatever your opening photo or video or whatever, that is going to be your center of visual impact. It's where you want to draw eyeballs. I would suggest you use a dominant element, so I would not just use text as your CVI. That's really hard to process. I would use a photo, maybe some kind of illustration, maybe a video. If you are going to use type, it needs to be really simple, not a paragraph of text, maybe a quote or something really easy to display. So the CVI in this website is quite clearly this gigantic photo, right? Much in the same as on ESPN, you can see it's this big photo of Dale Earnhardt, right? In this case, this is a text case, but the goal is not actually for you to read all of this. It's actually that all of these words are different moods, and those tie back to the actual article. So that gives you some rhythm to it. So rhythm is how people are going to move through your page. We're going to talk a lot later in a later module about how people move through your site, but in this case we want to know how people are going to move through your page. And so we want to capture their rhythm by constructing our site with modules that have some kind of natural progression. So there needs to be a logical sequence. Okay, if something is your primary information, it probably doesn't need to be below the fold so that they have to scroll down. That wouldn't make any sense. I would also suggest that you use some repetition in how you present headers. That's why we have things like H1 and H2 and all those header tags, is that it allows you to style it the same way every time. So if we're talking about rhythm, so we learned about the optical center from balance, we learned about the 0 point from balance, and we learned about the vectors from contrast. Okay, so now let's look at how people actually look at a website. Well, it looks something like this, where they're going to start on the circle, and they're going to come down, and this person kind of glanced all around, and then the last bit that they read is kind of this sidebar over here. So if we were to put this into a heat map, it might look something like this. So where people are going to look first is in the top left, which we learned that earlier, right? So they're going to look in the top left, and so if you have primary information, if you have something that is direly important for your user to know, it needs to go up here. If you put it over here, no one's really going to read it. All of this is really secondary information. They might read it if it's in the yellow, but even then it's pretty doubtful. So unity then is kind of one of our last elements, and it is what glues a site together. All of the other principles of design can be practiced, and you could have a site that has really interesting colors and the type is really well put together, and you have a good center of visual impact, and you've thought through all of that. But if it all doesn't tie together, it's just kind of going to fall apart. You could have all of those without actually having any cohesiveness. There's kind of two sayings that I'm going to give you here, adages really. So form follows function, and less is more. So remember, your site is not intended to tell everyone everything. You're not creating Wikipedia. You're creating a singular site, and so that singular site needs to have a singular purpose. And so less really is more. And so from focus, we remember that there's some things that are just going to dominate your visual perception. So if I make this show up again, where did you look first? right? You look into this big, gigantic rectangle, right? You didn't look up here. So if you put a bunch of really important information up here, you're going to lose your reader really fast. I would suggest that you stick to a few fonts, preferably all from the same family or families that are cohesively drawn together naturally. So there's plenty of websites out there where you can Google like fonts that go with Helvetica or whatever, and you'll find a grouping of fonts. I'm going to show you something that, in my opinion, hurts my heart quite a bit. So if you were to read a table of contents for a book that looked like this to me does not scream unity. In fact, it kind of seems to scream chaos, right? There's too much going on. So it's important to remember that needs to be cohesive, because less is ultimately going to be more. You're going to be able to tell your reader exactly where to go in a faster way if you just pick one of those fonts. The same is true with less is more when it comes to color. This is the website that I repeatedly show students when I think that they're getting a little bit too overwrought with maybe background images or whatever. So this is actually the art website for Yale University, and I would not suggest that you design your final site to look like this. This has too many things going on. There's a weird gradient here. There's just too many things going on. The same can really be said for this website. So there's just too many things going on without enough contrast and without enough direction for me to really know where he wants me to click, right? With Unity, you're going to have to learn how to use white space well, and you kind of have to learn with white space that it can both unify your site together while also dividing up the content. So it works to bring the site together into a singular design while also breaking up the modules of content. White space, however, does not have to be white. It can be any real color. It can be spaced out over things. Like this, I would consider this little gap right here white space. This is certainly white space. I think that this technically is kind of white space, even though that's a graphic. You can see they have white space down here, down here. So white space really allows you to draw your site together. It allows you to focus your user in while also dividing up your content. So luckily, someone has really put a lot of work into this for us. They've put a lot of thought and math and design work into creating this thing called the grid system. And so in our next video, we're going to talk all about the grid system, and I'm going to explain to you what it means for this class, and my expectations of your use for it. So if you are ready for that, you can go ahead and go to the grid system screencast. Thanks.